Thank you very much, Carl, and welcome to this morning discussion, which will take up the discussion and the film we had yesterday. I think all of you, or most of you, watched that film, and I'll just sum up the main topic, the main thesis of this film. It was about the 1975 Helsinki Act and its effect. And the film presented a success story of these negotiations to end the Cold War. And there was a certain tension between presenting this success story during the film and the discussion afterwards, because the film did not very much elaborate on the losses of the Helsinki Final Act and on those who fought this conference, who fought this Final Act, because they were the losers. I have in mind the Central European states who had to accept that they will stay on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, that they will be for more years to come, and they did not know at that time that it will end 14 years later, but it seemed to be for an eternity under the communist authoritarian rule. So this was an aspect the film did not make an issue of. And on the other hand, we had the discussion later on the actual situation, and while Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, was not presented as a leader of a criminal state, nowadays everybody on the panel agreed that it is impossible to sit at one table with the war criminal Vladimir Putin. And they did all of this for a good reason, but I think we should discuss this tension between a diplomatic success story of getting to one table with the adversary and the actual arguing that it is not possible to do it at all. And there is a good reason not to do it, and why the context is so different is one of the topics we will discuss now. And we have 4 participants to this panel, representing or elaborating on 4 different stories. They are from these 4 countries, but they could, as well as historians or professors of the history, argue for the other countries. We decided to make it in 2 rounds of 2 persons to have a more intensive debate. And the first one will be on Germany and Finland, representing 2 states which in the 1970s had a special interest in this conference. Finland as a border state to the Soviet Union, and Germany as a border state to its German neighbor. And the second round will be on Sweden and Poland. So I introduce my first guest to the first panel, representing or not representing, but discussing or arguing on Germany. It's Joachim von Puttkamer, who is a professor at the University of Jena for Eastern European history and a director at the Imre Kertész Centrum, also in Jena. And Laura Kolbe, who is also a historian here at the University of Helsinki. And the other 2 guests I will introduce when they come here in like 1 hour. So let's start. I had a very short email exchange with all the 4 panelists, and they told me that they want to make a very short introductory remarks. And we will start with Joachim von Puttkamer, and we will do that because he takes up to what I already said. He will speak about the context of the 1973-1975 negotiations on the Helsinki Final Act, and especially the context of German Ostpolitik, which was part of these negotiations, starting a little bit earlier than the Helsinki process. So, Joachim, the floor is yours, and afterwards we shift to Laura.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Volker. Thank you for the organizers. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today. I will start with a brief story. 2 days after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I joined a demonstration, one of the many demonstrations that took place throughout Germany and Europe, in my home city in Jena, and listened to our then Prime Minister, Bodo Ramelow from the Left Party, condemning the Russian aggression, but then speaking mostly about his political trajectory having begun in the peace movement and how pacifism had always been the obvious choice, and he felt by the Russian aggression fully vindicated in defending his own biography, pacifist biography. A couple of days later, after Olaf Scholz had announced a Zeitenwende and promised 100 billion euros for armament, there was an appeal signed by many people, among them good friends of mine at the university in Jena, protesting against an arms race and saying this was the wrong thing to do now, also with reference back to the 1970s and 80s. And since then, particularly in the sort of center-left and leftist spectrum of German politics, references back to the peace movement and to Ostpolitik, which are somehow merged in this debate, have become prominent in arguing for negotiations, for not trying to fight down Russia, but to incorporate it, to re-establish a fruitful and prosperous relationship between Western Europe, particularly Germany and Russia. And this mostly comes with references to Willy Brandt. Because if you invoke him in a public discussion among social democrats, or Sarah Wagenknecht would equally do so, you can always count on being on the right side of history. Now, what I'm just trying to sketch briefly is that there are some obvious parallels between Ostpolitik in the 70s and the nowadays situation. There are obvious differences, and what I find most interesting there, they're not so obvious differences. The obvious parallels to begin with is, of course, the warning against an arms race that could end in an outright, not only costs a lot of money, but at the expense of social issues, but could easily tilt into an open and armed conflict. So there is the need to soften the confrontation. And there is, as there was in the 1970s and 80s, the threat or the fear of an armed confrontation escalating into nuclear war in Europe. Another parallel is the prospect of trade, and not just that trade would be beneficial to all sides involved, but that trade might also effect change in Russia herself. Wandel durch Handel, and without sort of fully sort of discussing on whether the trade between West Germany and Russia in the 1970s and 80s really had a substantial effect in softening the systemic confrontation of the Cold War and bringing communism to an end. But the argument is there. And then one could argue, and I see it from time to time, on whether we have a similar situation as in the 1970s, that there is a systemic confrontation, it's an ideological confrontation. This, I would say, is open to debate. I tend to say, if one looks at not just Putin himself, but also some of the ideologues around him, there are elements of a systemic confrontation between whatever we can call the West nowadays, at least Western Europe, and Russia. even though it is less firmly rooted in socialist ideology and in economic order of the society. Now, the obvious differences, I think, are quite clear. As Volker already hinted at and told me yesterday, Putin is not Brezhnev. Brezhnev at the time had already ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia. He had not yet ordered in 1975 the invasion of Afghanistan. So it was quite clear that there was no reason not to negotiate with him, as there had been negotiations, of course, with communist leaders much before, but labeling Brezhnev a war criminal in 1975 wouldn't really have made much sense as it does with respect to Putin nowadays. A second obvious difference would be that there is an open and outright war in Ukraine, a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. This is not the situation of the Iron Curtain. I mean, the Iron Curtain was violent, it caused death, but it was not sort of everyday fighting on a large scale. And another obvious difference between today's references to Ostpolitik and the situation of Ostpolitik in the 1970s is that in the 1970s, German politics were closely coordinated with Western allies and embedded into a larger politics of détente, which had been going on since the late 1960s, which had not been fully disrupted by the Prague Spring and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. So that, I would say, is also an obvious difference. Now to the not so obvious differences, and I would like to hint at 3 points. The first is that Ostpolitik in the 1970s was a multi-leveled, multi-tiered undertaking. It did not just relate to Germany's relations with Russia, but it had very much to do, and that was closely interconnected with Germany's relations, particularly to Poland, also to Czechoslovakia, and with Germany's internal division, of course. So nowadays, the line of the bloc confrontation is much further east, and whoever nowadays refers back to Ostpolitik in the 1970s as a positive example easily forgets that German-Russian relations have a much longer trajectory, much longer history, not always one of cooperation, and whenever it is about cooperation, as in Rapallo in 1922, Eastern and Western neighbors tend to get nervous. So there's lots of historical baggage that comes and came with Ostpolitik in the 1970s, which is easily forgotten. The second and maybe most important, not so obvious difference is that Ostpolitik was about accepting the post-war order, the status quo, which came with a willingness to accept that the situation as it had emerged after World War II, particularly between Germany and the division of Germany and Poland, that one would accept it and try to sort of get beyond the immediate post-war period. We discussed yesterday to what extent the post-war period extends to 2015-16 or even longer. But we should keep in mind that in 1975, most of the political actors involved had a vivid adult memory of the Second World War, and most of them had been involved in fighting. And not Willy Brandt, not so much Egon Bahr, even though he had been a Wehrmacht soldier, the architect of Ostpolitik, but not involved in active fighting. But many other, even Social Democrats, had. And so had, of course, the Soviet negotiators and politicians. And that also means that they were all quite well aware of the propaganda that had been prominent on both sides in the 1940s during the war. And they were willing, there was a willingness to sort of address German guilt towards Poland, of course, but also to pick up on sort of the Stalinist example and making a differentiation between Hitlerite fascists on the one hand and Germans on the other. And on the German side, to drop the Stalinist part and say, okay, let's talk about our opponents not as Bolsheviks or Soviets, but as Russians, particularly Russians nowadays. So the prominence, I think, of World War II and the World War II experience in Ostpolitik and accepting the status quo should not be forgotten. And the third and last point is that if one looks closely, the negotiators, particularly on the Western side, but maybe also on the Eastern in the early and mid-1970s, had a vision for a long-term development of overcoming the bloc confrontation that comes with convergence. It might seem a bit sort of forgotten or strange, but in the late 1960s and the 1970s, there were visions of planning. The state sector in the West was expanding, and at the same time, during the Prague Spring in the socialist bloc, and also not just in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, there were discussions on whether there, as in Yugoslavia, could be elements of market socialism. So there was an understanding that maybe one could soften the ideological confrontation, both in economic terms, in social terms, also in political terms. We should not forget that Eastern Bloc leaders understood themselves as champions of a socialist understanding of human rights in the early 1970s. That's why they signed the accords in the first place. So there was this understanding that there could be a convergence that would soften the confrontation, and then somehow one would find one's way out of a bloc confrontation that, of course, came in the 1970s still with dictatorship. I would not say totalitarian, but dictatorship, and which hardened again in the 1980s. So the situation of the 1980s, when we have full-fledged opposition movement in Poland, Paweł Marcewicz is going to talk maybe a bit more about that, is different from the 1970s. Nowadays, what I find troubling is that we cannot pick up on this vision of a convergence between ideologically and economically and politically diverse models of how Europe should be organized. Both protagonists of a renewal of Ostpolitik, but I think also of what we heard yesterday from Doris Grünbein, and although some are more skeptical of this approach, we do have to acknowledge that all we can advocate for in political terms nowadays is to wait to keep Ukraine alive. There's a general understanding that Russia cannot be beaten in military terms as Nazi Germany had been beaten, and whether that's a meaningful comparison is also open to debate. But all we can do is wait, keep Ukraine alive, supply Ukraine with the necessary support, and then hope for something, somehow, sometime to change in Russia. And I think there's a big question in the room on what this change might look like. It has been since 2022. We've seen the Prigozhin adventure, which is a bit scary, I would say. And so I would close on this note that this inability to formulate a long-term vision of how this open war in Ukraine might end and a new European situation might look like is which should probably worry us more than whether a reference back to Ostpolitik is a good way to do politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. My personal impression is that those political forces which are referring to Ostpolitik as a model for dealing with Russia or with the situation, and now these forces are very weak. But on the other hand, if we see German politicians traveling to Baku to meet a Russian delegation, this is something which I held for unbelievable, and it still is unbelievable that this takes place, and these are exactly those persons who refer to Ostpolitik. But on the other hand, my impression is that this is a broader concept, and as you said, it was embedded in a Western policy, and the most dangerous political movement which is heading for an understanding with Russia is not the movement, is not the Social Democrats who refer to this Ostpolitik, but it's the alternative for Germany, and they don't want to embed an understanding with Russia in a broader European or international context, but they want just a kind of bandwagoning with Russia, so the Hungarian model, national interests, very mercantile style, but not a broader peace conference. We will discuss this later, because now the floor is Laura's, and she will more elaborate on a broader picture of Russia as a lieu de mémoire, or just a very important actor in Finnish history.
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome everybody here. Good to see you. Such a great audience on a Saturday morning. What is different in 70s and today is maybe the use of history and remembering already 70s, being young at that time. So the time was very much modernist. The dream was to create a modern, democratic, and even a historic society. History was not used in 1975, except, of course, everybody knew. We had the memory, as here was mentioned. Because history was directed towards the future, and that's what the Security Conference was all about, to create a better future, not to repeat what we had learned from the history. And that's exactly why it fitted so well into the Finnish context of 70s, when if you look at the national scene and the narratives which are repeated in my society, of course in every society, and also we have the European narrative. Let's talk about that a little bit later. But at least in Finland we had the narrative of cooperation and friendship, which was very essential after the Second World War. You know, I'm not repeating it. Finland lost the war and was forced to agree with the Soviet Union 1948 with the agreement of friendship and cooperation, which of course was crucial in understanding the diplomatic position of Finland in between the East and the West. And that's exactly the narrative of cooperation and friendship, which was very strong in the 70s and benefited in many ways the Finnish society. It framed, of course, the diplomatic reality, but it also offered great possibilities for Finland to bridge in between whatever could be considered the West and the East at various fields of social and political activities. I have been writing an article about cities and their cooperation with the Soviet Union cities during 60s, 70s and 80s. It was extremely wide action of cooperation. Thousands and thousands of municipal politicians met every third year in different Soviet and Finnish cities. And it was a true friendship. I mean, drinking a little bit vodka and listening the obligatory speeches created a platform for truly friendship attitudes. And also writing at the moment an article about Kostamus, which was a city in Soviet Union, Karelia, built completely by Finns, bringing, I mean, wealth both into the eastern part of Finland and creating a success for whatever could be called the trade between Finland and Soviet Union. And that trade was very crucial during the 70s and 80s. And when it collapsed, 91, there was, of course, very dramatic results. And this narrative of friendship and cooperation created, as you know, the notion of Finlandization, which was evident for us that it was the only possibility. As President Mauno Koivisto wrote in his book about the Russian idea 2001, that the only narrative that is essential for Finland is surviving. Surviving. And that is always in context with Russia. And what is the tactics in surviving? So there we have again several narratives. The second narrative, if you go a little bit back into the history, is the narrative of freedom and independence. And then we go back, of course, into the revolution year, 1917, and you know, of course, without any further teaching, how the Russian imperium was deconstructed and collapsed, and independent states were born. So every state, starting from Finland, ending up in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and many other countries, Poland, of course, Ukraine today, have a narrative which is always linked into the European context. What happened in Russia, the fall of imperium, what happened in Germany, the rise and fall during the First World War, and the German help and presence, of course, in this part of the Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and also in Finland. So the narrative of freedom and independence is very complex. Every time we have 2007, 2017, 2027, we are going to celebrate the Independence Day again. We have to reshape and retell the story, what actually happened 1917. The easiest way is to go to see what was written in the Declaration of Independence, 6th of December, because there are the key notions. I read a little passus here. Declaration of Independence. It was given by the parliament after the collapse in October Revolution. The people of Finland have, by this step, declaring the independence, taking their fate in their own hands, a step both justified and demanded by the present conditions. The people of Finland feel deeply that they cannot fulfill their national and international duty without a complete sovereignty. The century-old desire for freedom awaits fulfillment now. Finland's people step forward as free nation among the other nations of the world. So this is the narrative of freedom, which of course is repeated all the time, and the narrative is linked with the very complex processes leading to independence, and of course the very complex situation of civil war in spring 1918. Not a national happening, but deeply linked with the developments in Russia, of course in St. Petersburg, Lenin giving the independence to Finland, and of course German politics in this area. So we have the narrative of friendship and cooperation, very strong after Second World War, but also very strong during, as my professor Matti Klinge used to say, during the imperial time, Keisarin aika. He always refers that the time when Finland was annexed with the Russian Imperium was a good time for Finland. And actually it was. This narrative is not very popular at the moment, but looking what happened after 1809, Finland got its position as a kind of autonomous Grand Duchy, being free to create its state, die Staat, valtio. It's very important. The state existed already during 19th century. It existed 1917 when the Zeitwende took place, and the state is almost in the same form, both when you understand the legal basis and the political structure. So that created the narrative of let's say, the Finnish golden age as part of the Russian Imperium. And it had to do with the fact that St. Petersburg, the capital city, was very close to Helsinki, and everybody has been walking in the Senate Square. It's little Leningrad or little St. Petersburg, indicating the mental and cultural relation. And having the statue of Emperor Alexander II in the middle of Senate Square might feel a little bit weird. But of course he is there, because he's considered to be the good emperor, opening up the political developments, the parliamentary system, the economic, opening up the economic borders, etc. And again, Finland could benefit from the closeness of Russia. Look at the career of Marshal Mannerheim, who later on became the leader of the Independence War and Second World War. Mannerheim did the first 50 years in the Russian army, and the huge possibilities opened by the Russian society were part of this narrative of the golden age, of the relationship between Finland and Russia, and later on during 60s and 70s as the East trade, which was essential for having also the 1975 conference. it was already a lot of paths leading to that conference. And of course, the diplomatic position of President Kekkonen was crucial, and his role and his person, both in connection to the East and in connection to the West. We have been taking and doing research a lot of Kekkonen's relationship to Soviet Union and Moscow, but he had excellent relationships with the Western countries, of course. And always when being in Finland, you have to see the second context. It's the Norden, the Nordic dimension, Scandinavian context, which is always there balancing in between. I mean, during the Cold War, between the East and West blocks. So the Nordic dimension was extremely important because Nordic societies, although very different, share a lot of similarities. And the Nordic, whenever it goes into politics or cultural understanding or academic relationships, is there to balance this tension between the East and West, between Soviet Union and the American blocs. So it's also, and also in connection with the Germany, which for Finland's part was very complex and filled with historical understandings. Okay, not wanting to take any more, but remembering these memory places, which are very important. I think every country uses or can be used this notion of Pierre Nora, the memory place, lieu de mémoire, how we reshape our stories by using these lieu de mémoires. And Finland is definitely, of course, 1975. We are not in vain discussing here what it meant. It's a typical lieu de mémoire, but also the independence, and of course what happened in 1991, 1995, integration with the European Union, and now the NATO positioning in 1920s. They are all lieu de mémoire places. Also, I would like to bring into consideration the different approaches. You saw yesterday the map indicating where the Russian minority is located, and you could see clearly the division that Eastern Finland is very much populated by Russian-speaking minority, whereas the West Coast was rather empty or rather yellow, to put it in this way. And this is very important in understanding that when talking about Finland, it's never a kind of one nation speaking with one voice. But the regional division is very, very interesting. And the closer you and your family live at the eastern border, the more soft or the more understanding you are maybe to whatever happens in Russia or Soviet Union. And the more further up you live in the West Coast, the more you tend to be the spoker for the most important narrative, which is the narrative of having Russia as a kind of threat and eternal aggressor in our history. Russophobia, creating and linked with the nationalist agenda, is also very strong. And whenever happens a revolution, civil war, Second World War, Cold War, this Russophobic attitude can be very easily, it's there behind and behind the surface. Narratives told in families are very important. We are not only nourished by the diplomatic or state narratives, and I would like to end up by telling a little bit about my family, because I think it's quite typical, mixing up both Finnish, German, and Russian relations, and how my family, as an individual family, treated these paths of different narratives. From other side, I'm whatever could be considered to be a Finn, suomalainen, Finnish. And my grandfather participated in the war. He was a professional military and survived. But what happened was a very typical thing. The mouth was shut up. He never said the word. Never. The war was not discussed. The only memory was a Russian weapon he bought from the front. And that was shown to my big brother, not to me. From my father's side, as you can maybe understand, the name Kolbe is rather common in Germany. My family comes from St. Petersburg. the Russian minority, the German-speaking minority living in the Russian capital city. And also in my family, the mouth was shut. What happened after the Russian Revolution and what happened before the Second World War was unknown for me until I went to the sources and found out that the Kolbe family had left Soviet Union and Leningrad in 1938. My grandfather, Paul Kolbe, never came to Finland, to Viborg. He was imprisoned and probably taken to Stalin's camps. Later on, we might have heard that he was a dentist, that dentists were needed in Kazakhstan. Rest of my family, my father, my aunt, and my grandfather moved to the villa in Viborg. My grandmother, Larissa Kolbe, she never went back to Russia. Never. She had experienced 2 wars, lost her mother, brother, and sisters during the revolution. She was very strict, never going back. But what did my father, Boris Kolbe, do? He spoke, of course, Russia as mother language, which he never spoke with the children, by the way. He was a steel tradesman who worked the entire life what could be called in East trade, selling steel from and to Soviet Union in a company called Stalco. So these 3 narratives, I mean, are linked in my family. The narrative of aggression, independence, and threat, the narrative of cooperation and benefiting from the position, and then my grandmother's narrative of total saying no, saying stop to her past. And to shape and reshape a kind of Finnish identity is, of course, very challenging and very interesting, because you can follow these different paths, but also it's very painful at the moment. And I think, like many families, for example, from Karelian past, my family left Viborg, the Ukrainian aggression in February 2022, I mean, it went really into the heart. I mean, it really touched many of us, not only intellectually, of course, later on, but emotionally, because at the family level, you could really feel the great power politics. And this is, I think, something we in Finland are very much used to live with. Of course, with other countries as well. No other nation is free from memoirs of war, memoirs of conflict, memoirs of international tension. And that's exactly why it's so important that we discuss, open and deconstruct them today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was mostly interesting for me because it's so close to the Ukrainian situation today.
Yes.
This East-West spread.
Exactly.
The narratives, however, I would not call them narratives, which are represented in all families in Ukraine. However, when every day a train with dead soldiers and your father, your brother, your son might be in this train, you would not talk of a narrative. This is academic distance after 70 years or 80 years after the Winter War. You can talk with this distance.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, it's not about narratives, but about the truth.
Of course.
But from an analytical point of view, this is very, very similar. And some of these point of views in a situation when Russia is not defeated, but could be brought to a point when it will stop the aggression. The Ukrainian society will have to stick to some of these point of views, like surviving is the most important thing and not getting back lost territory. So it's not a lesson, but nevertheless, this Finnish history is important to understand if we want to understand what probably will happen in Ukraine.
Yeah, I take in consideration my grandmother's idea that she is a Russian lady who never could go back to Russia. I mean, emotionally it was so tough. And also I feel myself a big sadness, maybe never being able to travel to St. Petersburg anymore or Moscow. It's a sadness also linked. I mean, because it's going to take years. It's going to take maybe generations to reshape the understanding and neutralize it from the either strong hatred or other strong feelings linked into your family experience, and that makes it so.
And the same,
dramatic.
with some variations, is true for Germany. That's why I would like to ask you to open up a little bit the picture, not only looking on Ostpolitik as one and current narrative of relations with the Soviet Union and relations with Russia, but on the German perception of Russia, the changing German perception of Russia and the different narratives in the 20th century. I know this is the issue of not a book, but a library of books, but perhaps you could just draw some major lines of this changing perceptions and how they still nowadays, especially in the most strong pro-Putin movement, the Alternative for Germany, how perceptions of Russia which come from history are current in this movement.
Thank you. German perceptions of Russia throughout the late 19th and particularly the 20th century are probably at least as complex as the various narratives you've just been showing. I've been learning a lot about this from a book by Gerd Köhnen some 20 years ago, labeled The Russia Complex, where he tries to show that from the early 20th century onward, Russia sort of became maybe not an obsession, but a projection of very diverse hopes and fears for various political and social segments. Be it sort of enthusiastic embracement of the socialist revolution by many, not just communists, but also intellectuals in Germany in the 1920s, as an enormous and inspiring experiment in modernity that might go in a different direction than one's own experiences. You have strong conservative hopes towards Russia, as being one of the partners one could, who were not sort of benefited by the international order after the Versailles Peace Treaty. That is the Rapallo 1922 treaty between Weimar Germany and Russia. The hopes for an authoritarian model that would sort of was already embodied in Russia and might be useful for Germany as well. That is one thing you could also link up for today. And much of this is just a very broad brush, but what one could say is it's always as many of these narration, and that might be a difference to what you said about the Finnish narratives. It's always embedded in a struggle for what kind of modernity do Germans or Europeans hope for, and what is the core of one's own, what does one believe to be the core of one's identity that one would want to preserve under the pressure of rapid change in modernity? Is it, do you find it more in intellectual depth, for example, as opposed to presumed superficiality of French or American modern culture? Is it a more direct relation to nature, for example, a more religious expectation, and an openness to an understanding of the Russian soul as something that might speak also to Germans? So, speaking about Russia and the Soviet Union throughout the 20th century reflects speaking about modernity, and that also means, to a large extent, it's a reflection of how Germans think about America, the United States, As I said, I live in East Germany, and after my lectures or other public appearances, people come up to me, non-academic people, and we engage in discussions. I hear a lot of Putin propaganda there, but what I also hear a lot about is blame towards America, and it quickly turns out that people, when they want to speak positively about Russia, what they actually want to do is to speak negatively about the United States, and that this is what troubles them as much as the relationship towards Russia. And this is also what I believe to be more of a legacy of an East German trajectory into the present, which feeds into AfD as much as it feeds into the left, and Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, where the two meet, so to speak, and is a deeply skeptical attitude towards the United States, which recent developments during the last 6 months, of course, have sort of increased, understandably.
Yeah. I think it's very important what you say about exactly what happened and who were pro and who were against, and what kind of positions you were forced to take, because there didn't exist any sense of Europe in 60s or 70s. It was either the Western or Eastern, it was the United States or Soviet Union, and it was very difficult to create other identities. But what is important in the 70s is really the dream period for modernization and the cult of progrès. I mean, and the democratic understanding, it might be Western or Eastern, was very strong. And at least in Finland, I think the big issue was the role of communists, because we had a big communist party here. And the role of the Communist Party divided into two separate groups, the Stalin group and the less Stalin group, not going in very deep into that. But it was a powerful element in the society and created a kind of dominance, if not in numbers, so at least in using the voice and being the pro-Moscow, a kind of grouping. And it was a big mixture for Finnish people, let's say non-communist people, to understand that how is it possible that 25% of the population votes communists in 1940s? How can we explain this? What is the role of the communists during the Second World War? And how then, what happened to the very influential Western communist parties after 1991 is something which we have not written yet, and how they are infiltrated. I mean, we have the left-wing party, which is not maybe anymore Stalinist in its 70s sense, but there are tales to lead you to understand the role of communism and the communists in relationship already after the revolution, and especially after 1945, the very powerful Finnish Soviet Union society was interlinked with all relationships created between Finland and Soviet Union. And what has happened to these people, these societies, their understanding, as a historian, I know they have not disappeared. They are maybe in the margin, sitting there and maybe waiting the times to change and take the scene again. So, as we all know, nothing ends in history. It just gets a little bit tighter space, but the ideas are there, and when the times will change, I'm convinced that we are going to hear, let's say, the narrative of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin back again on the scene, which, by the way, 1970 was, I've tried to push this to my students, but when you look at the Soviet Union propaganda, so 1970 was maybe the peak year of Soviet presence in Western society, because at least here in Finland, at every level, we celebrated the 100 years of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It was huge. Every city, every village, every school, every university, every company had its Vladimir Ilyich Lenin celebration. And this is completely, nobody mentions that anymore, but I still hope some of my students would do a master thesis, because it's a very interesting procession of influencing the cultural climate by using the notion of Lenin. And it created a lot of tension, of course, in this country, because officially Lenin gave us the independence, and unofficially, of course, we have the narrative of threat and oppression and communist totalitarianism. So Lenin is very interesting also, lieu de mémoire in our history.
Before I will open up this first discussion to the audience, and I will do it right now because we'll change the panelists in like 5 minutes. I have one last question to Joachim, because I already know that in the second round we will discuss the question how stable the pro-Western or the coalition against Russian aggression is in Sweden. I would like to ask you both just to shortly elaborate on this question for Germany. What are the prospects of the support for Ukraine and the stability of this version of Russia that now is in government?
Thank you. It's an important question, not so much to the historian, though. But anyhow, at the very moment, I would say with the new German government, support for Ukraine seems fairly stable. I was not so sure when we saw this horrifying scene in the White House, where with Putin, Trump, and Zelensky and D.C. Vance. Sorry, that was the moment when I thought if the United States drop Ukraine, Putin will, and that's where he came from in my mind, will start to blackmail Germany with a nuclear threat, and Germany will not be immune against this. And it is very hard to assess from the outside at this stage how German arms delivery, and particularly these cruise missile, Taurus cruise missiles, whether this will actually happen or not happen, and what it will imply. But I do think that even under the current situation, with the current government, Germany is vulnerable to being blackmailed by a nuclear threat. That's the one thing. And the second thing is, as long as we have a stable federal government, and I think we are on the safe side, but that's for... The last one didn't last for 4 years. So AfD, nobody knows where the upper level for AfD actually is in East Germany or in Germany as a whole. You just mentioned it's just a few people in Germany who might wish for a change. According to recent opinion polls, about 20% of the German population wish for better relations and a rapprochement with Russia. 20% you would say is not that much, but 20% means in East Germany it's 40%, if not 50%. And with upcoming elections in East Germany, it's quite expectable that sooner or later AfD will be in a regional government. And how that will play out on federal policies is very difficult to predict.
Yeah, okay. And for Finland?
Yes, thank you.
After joining NATO?
Well, it's a long and complex story.
Yeah.
But of course, historically, Germany has been extremely important in all Zeitwendes in our history, starting from 1918, 1944, and then again in context with the European integration. 1990s, the German help and support has been both at the concrete level, but also at the symbolic level, and stretching, by the way, so far that we were electing a German prince to be the King of Finland, 1918, as many of you know, as a symbolic act for this. So I think looking from a smaller country's perspective here in between East and West, Germany has historically been our, let's say, hope for getting a position in the European context, because small nation is not powerful enough to do that, even if it has the bridging role, which has been quite a success. So I think we are looking both at state level and also at individual level towards the Germany. What happens in Germany, it's a wave that comes also to Scandinavia and to the Baltic Sea and influences not only Finland, but Baltic countries and the whole Central Europe. So we, of course, I'm naive in saying that we live in a hope and hope that Germany will take its position as the leading nation in Europe.
So, questions to the first two panelists from the audience? Yes.
Should be a mic somewhere.
Yeah.
Who was?
I'm Tomasz Chłoń, heading the Polish embassy in Helsinki.
Please speak up a little bit.
Polish embassy in Helsinki.
No.
And you all, both panelists already, you started to go from the relations with history to the relations with the future. And I have a question to Professor Kolbe. You mentioned this narrative of cooperation. When you look at the political scene in Finland, you would think that the natural actor of bringing back this narrative would be vasemmistoliitto. But how about the other parties, especially the Social Democratic Party?
Yeah, oh dear, lecture 45 minutes. It's a good question. Let's say the biggest achievement of President Kekkonen was to unite the political parties. Let's say the major political parties, of course, they were oppositional groupings, to support his Soviet Union politics, or the politics of friendship and cooperation, let's put it in this way. And this, of course, created a lot of tensions within the political parties. Let's say the right-wing party, Kokoomus, let's say the Social Democratic Party is still, most of the parties were divided either in concrete, like the Social Democrats, or internally. And still in writing the history of these parties, this approach towards Kekkonen and his Soviet Union politics is one of the crucial questions. Yeah. But today, of course, if you look at the post-war 45, when the Communist Party was very crucial in creating the friendship society and opening up the relations, we are not really seeing any political party taking that role at the moment. The time is not maybe right yet.
Okay, I'm Akipuli, representing some organizations in Ukraine and Finland. And, well, first of all, I would like to comment on the term Russophobia. I think it is a term that has been coined by Kremlin and exclusively should be avoided in normal society discussions. The second, I understood that how you used it for Finnish contexts. I would say the people you call Russophobes are more like the realists who recognize the eternal, perpetual threat from Muscovy, even during the sunshine campaigns, which tend to come always after the economic downturn in the East. And then when they have money flowing in from windows and doors, then they get aggressive again. That's a simple cycle on historic sense already for centuries. And then I have a question to our German participants, because you mentioned Wandel durch Handel, so the trade making change. Don't you think that it's more like Wandel durch Anbiederung? Because it kind of resuscitated half-dead economies to somehow convince their citizens about viability of a dead-end dictatorship.
I start with the term Russophobia. I don't remember that anyone on the panel used it, but I personally...
Laura used it.
I used it as a kind of narrative of not...
Yeah, but I completely agree that this is a term which was coined by the Kremlin in the last years, and it's used to blame everybody who is contradicting on any Russian or Kremlin position. He's called a Russophobe, so completely true. Yeah, okay. Yeah. We agree? Then up to you to the other questions.
Yes, thank you. That's what you said about Wandel durch Anbiederung is a common political argument in German discourse as well. That there's something, that there might be something deeply immoral about advocating trade with Russia, particularly while it is still fighting the war in Ukraine, while there is not even a ceasefire. It's part of the political argumentation, and I would say it is more. There are more grounds for seeing it this way nowadays than it was during the 1970s and 80s.
So without the microphone, we don't hear you. But I think you continue this discussion in a smaller round, because we now will change the panelists. We'll stick to the same debate, but with two other countries, and afterwards, in the break, we will continue this in smaller circles. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.